There's a lot of really great things that happen in AMC's The Walking Dead, but there's a lot of things that didn't happen in AMC's The Walking Dead, but they're things that took place in the comics that I really wish we got to see to screen. So in this video, we're going to be discussing some of those things. I'm sure there's more, and I'd love to hear from you down in the comments what your moments are, but this is kind of just my no-nonsense list where I'm going to be talking through those. So the first thing that I want to discuss is Rick's discussions with Negan about how to handle the Whisperers. And I know that's a relatively small thing in the grand scheme of what we got, but just the general fact that we didn't really get much of any interactions with Rick and Negan throughout the show is crazy to me. And when I say that, I'm talking about post-war, like post-all-out war, we didn't get much. We had, in season 9, we only had a couple episodes where we saw like little moments with Rick and Negan. And that's really unfortunate because that was a very big dynamic that took place in the comics. And it was one of those things that made the comics very strong. It was one of the things that made post all-out war intriguing because the Whisperers were fun and all of that stuff, but a big portion of the story, which we did get to see in fairness in the AMC version, but a big portion in the comics was the story with Rick and how Rick handles Negan and how they kind of have to work together at times. It was an element that was really intriguing, and it's one I'm actually working on a video on, and I've been saying this for a while, but it's true. I'm working on a video about comic Negan versus show Negan. And I think a big reason for such a stark difference is because Rick wasn't around. And because of that, Rick in the comics had such an integral part with him that just didn't exist in the show. And it's a shame. Yeah, we got a couple moments there that were really nice to see. Like, it was very nice to see the bickering back and forth in the beginning of season 9. But it would have been great to see when Rick is really down bad in the middle of the Whisperer War after losing everyone from the Pikes, going to Negan and being like, how do I rile this community to want to fight these people? What do I do? That is a classic element that we didn't get. And it was cool that we got stuff with like a Carol partnership with Negan where he went out to kill, Alpha and all that stuff. That was cool, but it's not the same when you have a character that has pretty low stakes in the Negan relationship do that sort of thing. And it was nice, I guess, because we finally got to see Carol interacting with Negan. It's just not exactly the same, and it's unfortunate that we didn't get that. That was a big part of post all-out war, and it's probably part of the reason that the show wasn't as good as the comics in those areas. And the second portion of that, and you're going to notice a lot of these things have to do with things that happen after all-out war. Not all of it, but a lot of those things. The next one, speaking of that post all-out war, is Carl and Lydia's relationship. And yes, we did get it in the form of Henry and Lydia, and that was great. But it's not Carl. I made many videos about this. You guys know how I feel about that. It wasn't Carl. And that was such an important part because we followed this kid for years, and to see him develop and have, a sexual relationship as well as a more mature relationship with a character that was literally feral is just so interesting of a story. And their relationship was, in terms of the apocalypse, pretty beautiful. I liked it. I thought it was great. In terms of The Walking Dead, it's not really that beautiful, but whatever. It would have been so nice to see. I mean, I don't think we needed to see Lydia licking Carl's eye socket. I'm glad we didn't get that at all. But that dynamic was another element to the Whisperer arc that was just so much better in the comics. And actually, as a matter of fact, at that, I wholeheartedly think that the Whisperer arc in the comics is significantly better of a story than it is in the show. But again, that's not necessarily a fault of the writers, even though part of it is, but a big portion of that arc had to do with characters that did not exist in the show because Scott Pimple decided to kill off Carl and Rick or Andrew Lincoln had to leave. You know what I mean? So you're losing the two most integral parts of the Whisperer arc. And you don't have Andrea there to tell a very important story that happened in the comics, which is something we're going to discuss. And actually, as a matter of fact, I have it further down on the list, but let's talk about it now. Andrea as a character in the show. We didn't get any of that. But 2, Andrea's death. And they tie in together big time. Yes, in the show, we got an Andrea who died, but that Andrea was not Andrea. Like, essentially, the Andrea that is in the comics is kind of like a mix between Michonne and a little bit of Carol, because Carol didn't exist in the same capacity at all in the comics. So Andrea took on this role that was somewhere in the middle of both of them. Yeah, Andrea in the comics wasn't like a samurai like Michonne is. That stayed very true, and that always was the case in the actual comics and the show. Like, Michonne stayed the same. Andrea, totally different character, and she was the love interest of Rick. And it's a shame that the casting of Andrea in the show just wasn't the same. And it's not anything to say about the actress who played her, but I don't necessarily think, and I've gone on record, I've said this in the past, I don't think the person who played her in AMC's version was the right pick for Andrea. And I think that had a lot to do with why they went a different direction. Maybe. I'm sure there was more behind the scenes stuff and things like that. But regardless, I'm going off on a tangent. Andrea's death in the comics was arguably the most important and integral element to that story. It was kind of like, it was in a sense like Carl's death in the show, but it had less of that visceral impact that someone like Carl's death would have, because Rick didn't live for Andrea. Like, he did, but he didn't live in the same capacity for Andrea as the entire Walking Dead is about a man doing anything in the world for his son. That's the story of that's one of the many stories of The Walking Dead, but that's like one of the biggest parts of it. It doesn't have necessarily the same impact, but the point I'm making is, in terms of the comics, Andrea's death had arguably the most weight. Of course, Lori and Judith's death way earlier did in a similar way, but not the same. Andrea's was that heart that Carl's was in the show. And it was just told so beautifully. There were some amazing moments there, like Rick and Andrea together, where Andrea's essentially telling Rick that he has to go on and he can't let this death affect him. Like, he can't. And there was just some beautiful imagery that came out of that. There was beautiful storytelling that came out of it. It was so impactful, and it was something I would do anything to see on screen. I truly hope one day, I know Robert Kirkman said it won't happen, but I do truly hope one day we get to see a really true, faithful adaptation of the comics to tell that story, because that story out of all of these is one of the ones that triumphs all of it. Like, I know that sentence didn't make that much sense, but it really is true. That was such an iconic and pivotal moment in the show, or in the comics, that we just needed to see. We truly did, and it's a shame that we didn't. One thing that we did get, that we just recently got in The Walking Dead, The Ones Who Live, but in a totally different way, is Rick losing his hand. But in the comics, I love that it happened by the governor, and at large, I love that the governor was this just bombastic pirate looking dude in the comics. Like, I do wholeheartedly think David Morrissey, who played the governor, I think that's his name, he did a marvelous job of bringing a character who was very odd from the comics to screen. So I love David Morrissey's version of it. Like I wouldn't take that back for a second, but I do like the craziness that we lacked from the governor in the comics. Immediately, like literally right after meeting Rick, he just chops off his hand to assert his dominance. It's like laying his dick on the table. Like that we needed to see that. And I know from a budgetary constraint and all of that stuff, it's not that easy to have your main character, who's in some of the most episodes of the show than any other character. I know that's a lot of money to do for CG all the time, but you don't need to. You could do CG like here and there, and then just do what they did in the comics or in The Walking Dead, The Ones Who Live, where they had the thing on his arm. Like, you could have done that. I don't know why they didn't do that. It's a shame that they never cut off Rick's hand early on, but it told such a cool story, and it made Rick more badass than he is. I mean, he was very badass in the show too, but like the fact that early on in the story he lost his hand would have been something I would have loved to have seen in the show. Now, up next, and I probably should have put this up higher than I did, but it goes along with Rick's discussion with Negan, but it's Carl's discussion with Negan. And yes, we got an adapted version of that with Judith, but Judith doesn't matter, no offense, she just doesn't matter nearly as much as Carl does, and Carl's relationship with Negan was so strong. It was already so strong in season 7 and 8 of the show, so it would have just enhanced it so much if they just showed us Carl and Negan. And again, this is another reason why they just shouldn't have killed him off, but here we are, Scott Pimple. Thank you for that. Everything that's happened since then is a ramification of you making that horrible decision. But Carl's relationship with Negan would have been something I would have loved to have seen. And that really doesn't need too much of an explanation. I think that's an obvious one. And the last one here is Negan's real story with Maggie. That would have been something that would have been amazing. And in general, I love AMC's Negan. I truly do. But I also love the comics Negan for very different ways. And I said it in the beginning of this video. I'm making a whole separate video about this because I could go off on tangents about just that specifically. But Negan in the show and Negan in the comics are two different characters who have the same story. You know what I mean? Like, they have different stories, they have different redemption arcs and all of that stuff. And in the comics, he was never really redeemed. So having the story with Negan and Maggie from there, where there wasn't really a redemption arc, it was just kind of like they ended as civil as possible, but they still had obviously beef and all of that stuff. It just would have been great to see. And just in general, that send-off between Maggie and Negan in the comics, where they met at some random place, I forget exactly how it went down, but they went and basically had the scene that took place in season 9, episode 5, but in a way that was more like, fuck you, get out of my life sort of thing. And I liked that more, and I liked that was kind of the natural conclusion to Negan's story. In theory, it worked really, really well in the comics. And though I love everything we got from the show with Negan, I think seeing that visually to screen would have been really great too. And it's something I hope we get in a future reboot of sorts of The Walking Dead. I think it's a very important thing to tell a story like that as real as you can. And this whole redemption thing, yes, in real life, if these events actually took place, I'm sure over time it probably would have played out like Negan in the show a little bit, or they would have just killed him or just banished him like they did in the comics. You know what I mean? Like, I want to see that. And I also want to see the show version. I don't know. I'm somewhere torn. But these are the moments that I had. I'm sure there's more. I just made a list and decided to start yapping about it, really. So that's that. I would love to hear from you what you would have liked to have seen from the comics to the show. Definitely let me know down in the comments. Whoa. Wait a minute. I just realized I recorded an entire video about things that I wanted to see in The Walking Dead from the comics and didn't talk about Rick Grimes' death? I don't even know how I could publish this video. And yes, I'm recording this in a closet, but obviously that's another thing. We're going to save that for an entirely separate video because it's a very important topic and I want to tie it into The Ones Who Live, so stay tuned for that. And yeah, I don't know how to end this one, so bye.